Good morning, History 340. It's good to see you again. I hope you're all doing well, first of all, and I hope that everybody is safe and is socially distanced. So best wishes to everybody. It's a little awkward, right? We're having our first video lecture, but we're going to do the best that we can, and I'm going to make today's talk a little bit shorter than future talks will be, because I want to see how the technology works. And sorry for the awkward angle. I'm using my phone to record this while I get my laptop camera situation figured out. So this is a trial run, and let's hope that it succeeds. So before jumping into the topic for today, just a few things about the syllabus. First, I hope you all have it, have a chance to read it. I've tried to change as little as possible in terms of the intended course structure, of course having to shift to online. But just a couple of points that I wanted to just emphasize, and I'm pulling up my copy of it here. And first is that, again, as the syllabus says, and as I've mentioned in email, we'll do this model now where on Mondays, today, I'll record lectures. On Wednesdays, I will post prompts related to each week's topic, building on what I've talked about each Monday, but also building upon the readings. And those are going to be posted on Wednesday, the discussion responses on Blackboard under the discussion tab. And you'll have both Wednesday and Thursday to complete the responses. So this is going to be an asynchronous class, meaning that you aren't expected to meet or listen to these lectures or respond to the discussion prompts at a specific time. So another way of saying that is our intended class time is thrown out the window. We're not here pegged to the 3:10 to 4:25 Monday to Wednesday, like we of course have been while we were meeting normally in class. But otherwise, aside from the change structure, I've kept the assignments the same. So again, you'll have primary source responses, and as you've noticed, I hope, reading the syllabus, I've lowered the number of those that I'm requiring. So there will be 6 now, rather than 8. So these are not in addition to what you've already done. So let's say that you've completed 4 responses. That means you'll need to upload just 2 more over the course of the semester. I don't think anybody's done 6 yet, but if you've done 6, then you don't have to do any more. And in addition to these responses, which are the same format as the responses that we've been doing this semester, you'll have a midterm exam and a final exam, as we had already scheduled. And of course, those were supposed to be in class. There obviously won't be any more, but we will upload our exams to Blackboard. And so just note that the first exam midterm exam, I should say, is pushed back to next week, week 10. And as the syllabus states, next Monday, the 30th of March, I will post a short video that will be something of a midterm examination review. On Wednesday, April 1st, I will upload the midterm examination to Blackboard, and then you'll have until Monday, April the 6th to upload your response. So you have 5 days to complete the exam from next Wednesday to Monday, April the 6th. So I hope there's no confusion, but if you certainly have any questions, feel free to email me, and many of you have already. So that's what we're doing, and I think it's pretty straightforward. And again, in these unfortunate circumstances, it's I think the best way to organize the rest of the class and to try to why am I blanking on the word? Complement, maybe is the best word I could use, our changed circumstances. So again, email me if you have any questions about that. But what I want to spend the rest of this video talking about is to build on the last class discussion that we had the last time we saw each other, which was almost 2 weeks ago now, right? Which was slavery, anti-slavery, and the Constitution, and that's part 1. So today we'll do part 2. And just as a reminder, and since it's been 12 days since we had this last class meeting, we began to sort of sketch out the systemic conflicts with reference to United States national and state law and the Constitution with regards to slavery and anti-slavery. So if you remember, just as a quick point of review, we talked about how this sort of structural conflict grew out of a relationship of slavery to the Constitution that has a two-word name, the federal consensus. And that's something that I wrote down on the chalkboard last class. Federal consensus, an understanding that slavery as a legal institution is recognized by the national government, and it's recognized in the Constitution, but that the actual laws that made slavery either legal or illegal were state laws, the individual states. So as a reminder, I discussed how that meant that, for example, in Virginia, just to pick one large slave state, slavery was legal because the law of the state of Virginia made slavery legal. Whereas in the northeastern states, but I'll just take the example of Pennsylvania here, one that I've discussed already in a couple of classes. In 1780, that state made progressively the institution of slavery illegal, something called gradual emancipation. So that, again, this federal consensus recognized this, that if a state wanted to make slavery legal, it continued to have a legal institution of bondage, then it could. But if it did not, as in the case of Pennsylvania, the national government could not force a state to accept slavery or to make slavery legal. And again, this is called the federal consensus. And the second point of review that I want to just bring up as a reminder is that when we're looking at slavery from it came up on my phone. When we're looking at slavery from the perspective of the law, we just want to note that the central theme is that the law of slavery is a law of property ownership, right? Which is that slaves were held as chattel property, CHATTEL, and that's a term that you've seen me write on the board multiple times throughout the course of the semester. And that meant that slaves, amongst the many other horrifying aspects of slavery that we might talk about, the day-to-day treatment, the physical and psychological torture, that meant that slaves were denied the most fundamental human right, is the way that I phrased it previously, which is the right to own their own body, or the right to self-ownership, which made slavery so inhumane, in addition to other aspects of the inhumanity of slavery treatment and the like. So those 2 points I just want to bring up, and I just want to have those in our minds as we go through some of the events I'm going to talk about today. Because as part 2 of this slavery, anti-slavery in the Constitution, we're really here focusing on the decade of the 1850s, when we really begin to see these sort of longer-term structural conflicts, again, from the perspective of the law, really sort of develop into a conflict that had several different names. One of the most famous ways of expressing this conflict is that it was an irrepressible conflict, a conflict that cannot be stopped. It was often referred to as a crisis in the 1850s, that there's an impending crisis, a showdown between the free states of the North and the slave states of the South. And again, this decade of the 1850s is really when we get to begin to see this tension build and ultimately explode into civil war. In 1861. And while we look at the decade of the 1850s as this crisis decade, I just want to have a sort of mission statement about today's class, which is that the point of today and the point of next week, in part you'll see when we begin discussing the Civil War itself, which I'll talk about briefly next Monday in addition to discussing the midterm. Our main goal in this class, in this particular topic for this week, is to understand how the legal system of the United States allowed the Civil War to happen, meaning a war, as we'll see, which broke out in April of 1861 between the Union, the Free States of the North, and the Confederacy, states, former slave states in the United States, which seceded to form their own country that they called the Confederate States of America, or the Confederacy. How do we explain the Civil War? That's the goal of any scholar of the 1850s, and certainly it's our goal here in this constitutional history class. So the starting point here is then the year 1850, and this is something that we talked about at the very end of our last class, so this is a little bit of review, but conflicts which had emerged going all the way back to the Constitution through the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which created an imaginary line above which, to the north, slavery would be prohibited, and below, to the south, slavery would be allowed, really began to take a sharp escalating turn in 1850 with the so-called Compromise of 1850, which is what we talked about at the very end of last class. A law, or a compromise, which generated, from the legal perspective, an extremely controversial law called the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This was an act that was blatantly pro-slavery. It was one that had long been desired by slaveholding politicians who were angered, I think is an appropriate word, by northern free state authorities' obstacles to recovering fugitive slaves who had run from slave states into free states. And that's an issue that we talked about last class. And indeed, an issue that dates back to the Constitution, right? Which, if you remember, there is a clause in the Constitution, the Fugitive Slave Clause, which gave slaveholders the constitutional right to recover fugitive slaves. Northern states, as I talked about last class, through personal liberty laws, had made that process more difficult. Slaveholders demanded in 1850 this Fugitive Slave Act, which was very controversial because it made the recovery of fugitive slaves an area of national authority and no longer an area of state authority. So this is another way in which we return to probably our central theme of the class so far, which is the conflict between national and state jurisdiction legally, and the larger conflict of areas of authority. But this compromise was one in which each side, meaning free states of the North and their politicians, and slave states of the South and their politicians, received something that they wanted. The slaveholders, the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, free state politicians, the admission of California into the United States as a free state. But even though each side got something that they desired, it was very clear moving forward that the sort of larger structural conflict continued to exist. And much of the history of the decade of the 1850s attests to this. When you go back retrospectively and learn about it, it can make it seem as though the Civil War was inevitable because we have lists of events ticking off things like the Compromise of 1850. What I'll talk about next, the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, ticking off lists of events that seem to suggest that the Civil War was inevitable. Nothing is inevitable, but it's fair to say that there's growing tension. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 did have a reference to another area in which there was some national government say or authority over the future of slavery, which is territorial expansion. And that's something that we talked about last class as well. This Kansas-Nebraska Act applied a concept called popular, as in this class is very popular, sovereignty, SOVEREIGNTY, popular sovereignty, to the question of slavery and expansion. Another way to think about that term is to restate it as popular will. Popular sovereignty means popular will. What did this mean? It gave, in the future, beginning with the Kansas Territory, hence the Kansas-Nebraska Act title of this act, gave in the future, beginning with Kansas, the settlers of a particular territory the exclusive right to decide whether or not the state that would be carved out of the territory in the future would be free or slave. So appealing to the popular will, the popular sovereignty. In one sense, you might wonder why this would be so controversial. Right? It seems part of a democratic process. Right? Allow the individual settlers, and to be very clear, this meant white men who could vote, just to be specific, the ability to decide if their territory would be free or slave. That on paper might seem like a reasonable act, a reasonable law. And in a vacuum, in isolation, it seems reasonable. What it turned out to be was a victory for pro-slavery politicians, because the Kansas-Nebraska Act invalidated the Missouri Compromise, which we've talked about before, but again, which split the country in half at the 3630 parallel, North, freedom; to the south, in future states, slavery. And what it particularly did was scare the wits out of anti-slavery Northerners who imagined a future, which never came to pass, but they couldn't know this in 1854, but imagine a future in which the free states of the North, especially in the Northwest, not what today we think of the Northwest as Oregon and Washington, but the states of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, today we call it the Midwest, in which those states might potentially be surrounded by slave states as the country spread westward, and new states were carved out of the Rocky Mountain region, and today what we call the Great Plains region, including where Kansas and Nebraska are today. So this Kansas-Nebraska Act was extremely controversial, especially amongst free citizens of free states in the North. And just to take one example of how controversial this was, it was so seen by many Northerners with anti-slavery principles as such a victory for slave owners that it made one person in particular decide to become, again, a public figure, somebody we've all heard of before. His name is Abraham Lincoln, who was a retired politician in the early 1850s. He had served one term in the United States Congress, but who was so enraged by what he interpreted the Kansas-Nebraska Act to be, which was the national government rolling over to the interests of slave owners, that he decided to once again attempt to become a public figure. And this is when Abraham Lincoln began giving speeches in public, which were anti-slavery in their arguments. Moving forward from the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, other events in Kansas escalated the tensions. And here I'm referring to a series of acts of violence committed in Kansas in 1856 and 1857 that collectively at the time are called Bleeding Kansas. It's a very evocative name, right? But again, a series of acts of violence committed by pro-slavery settlers who moved to Kansas and anti-slavery settlers who had also moved to Kansas with the intention of making Kansas either a slave or free state. And these were, again, murders is the correct word to use, that were committed by both sides. So there's two famous examples, the two most famous examples I'll give you. One is called the Sack, S-A-C-K, of Lawrence, Lawrenc, a small town in Kansas. Sack means the destruction of the town of Lawrence. Lawrence, which by the way is today where the University of Kansas is located, was founded as a free state settlement, meaning it was founded by anti-slavery Northerners. The town was attacked in the middle of the day by pro-slavery, they were called ruffians, but pro-slavery marauders is another way to think of them, who burnt down the town and murdered several people. Anti-slavery settlers were murdered. So this is a pretty major event, was widely reported throughout the national press, and really inflamed tensions, in this case in the North, right? When many anti-slavery Northerners read reports of the sack of Lawrence, the destruction of Lawrence, they were, as you might expect, pretty outraged. Second event that I'll mention briefly was a response to this sack of Lawrence. It was retaliation, is really the correct word to use, in which a radical abolitionist activist named John Brown, perhaps you've heard of him, he would later become very famous for reasons that I'll talk about perhaps a little bit later today. John Brown and some of his associates, including some of his sons, murdered a family of Southerners, a Southern family that had moved to Kansas. This had various names, but the Southerners called it the rape of Ottawatomie. Pottawatomie is the name of the town nearest to where this family lived. And they hacked them to death, actually, with swords. So this is the kind of acts of violence that collectively were called Bleeding Kansas. And again, really enraged tensions on both sides. Another event that I'll just mention briefly, mostly because it's just shocking in its sheer violence, happened actually in Congress, in the United States Congress. An event called the Caning of Sumner. Caning refers to a cane that one would use to support themselves while they walk around, Caning, of Charles Sumner, which is Sumner. Charles Sumner was a senator from Massachusetts, so from a free state, who had been very ostentatiously critical of slavery and critical of slaveholders. And he did this in public speeches. He did this in speeches in Congress. And in retaliation for a particularly anti-slavery speech, a South Carolina representative, member of the House of Representatives, actually walked into the Senate one morning early while Charles Sumner was getting his day started, sitting at his desk, and caned him, beat him over the back of the head with a heavy cane, hence the name Caning of Charles Sumner, almost killing him, actually, causing severe skull fractures and brain swelling, and he barely survived. And it's just shocking in its violence and in the sort of what's the word for it? Excuse me. The kind of daringness, if you will, of a pro-slavery South Carolina representative who was himself a slave owner for almost murdering a member of Congress. I always say when I think of this that as much as we today in the 21st century are like to think that politics and political conflicts are extremely exaggerated, this is a much longer step forward than what we feel like today is the conflict between Republicans and Democrats. This is the one congressperson almost murdering another one. So the point of all of this is to say that these tensions are beginning to rise. And now if we turn our attention specifically to Supreme Court cases, we have another instance of rising tension, and this is the Dred Scott decision, which I've asked you to read for today. Of course, like all of other cases, there are links to it. There's a link to it on Blackboard. This decision is probably, and I think it's fair to say, not even probably, it is one of the most infamous Supreme Court decisions in United States history. And again, one that very much inflamed tensions between anti-slavery Northerners, pro-slavery Southerners. This decision was handed down officially in early 1857, but the events of the case that led to the decision date back to the middle of the 1840s. And you can read in the overview of the case a little bit more detail about the events of the case, but I'll just say briefly here that the Dred Scott decision revolved around the life of a man named Dred Scott, who was an enslaved man, born enslaved in Virginia, but who was moved, didn't voluntarily move, to Missouri as a young adult. His slave owner, moved him to St. Louis. And Dred Scott was subsequently, in 1845, was sold from his previous owner to a man named John Sanford, which gives the official name of the case as Scott versus Sanford, even though we call it the Dred Scott decision. John Sanford, his new owner, was a doctor in the United States Army. So as a career military officer, he was stationed throughout the country as a part of his duties, which is still common for, of course, career military members today. So he was deployed, I should say, to free states and territories soon after purchasing Dred Scott. He was stationed in Illinois, a free state. He was later stationed in the Wisconsin Territory, a free territory that is now the state of Wisconsin. And he brought Dred Scott with him. And so Dred Scott lived in free territories and free states for almost 10 years. And when he was returned to Missouri, a slave state, he sued for his freedom based on the fact that he had resided in free territories and free states for so long that he should therefore become free. This is his basic argument. But this decision was ultimately a decision that was blatantly pro-slavery. It was handed down by a Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roger Taney, even though his last name looks like Taney, it's actually pronounced Taney. who himself was a slaveholder and who wrote the decision as one that would clearly benefit the interests of slaveholders. And so the first portion of the decision, which applied specifically to Dred Scott, was that Dred Scott was not entitled to his freedom. Although, as it turns out, Dred Scott had actually purchased his freedom before this decision, so it didn't have any practical effect on Dred Scott himself. But the second and third parts of the decision are what made it so controversial. As I said, probably the most infamous Supreme Court decision, top three infamous Supreme Court decisions in United States history. So I'll quote a couple of sections from this decision, which, again, you have a link to. The first one I want to quote is from this first section, Roman numeral 1, Article 4, which applied to the prospect of African American citizenship. So Chief Justice Taney went out of his way to make a broad statement about African American citizenship. And what did he say? Well, to paraphrase, impossible for African Americans to be citizens. And so I'll read a quotation from Section 1, Article 4. The free, I'm going to not use the N word, but a free person of the African race whose ancestors were brought to this country and sold as slaves is not a citizen within the meaning of the Constitution of the United States, end quote. So again, to paraphrase that, Chief Justice Taney declared that African Americans were not citizens. And in another portion of the decision, he says that African Americans were not, could not, and could never be citizens of the United States. Two articles down from the section I just quoted, again, Part 1, Article 4, we have Part 1, Article 6. And here's another quote that I want to pull out that really, I think, demonstrates how the Dred Scott decision was so blatantly and clearly pro-slavery. And this section says, quote, "The only two clauses in the Constitution which point to this race," meaning African Americans, that point to this race treat them as persons whom it was morally and lawfully to deal in as articles of property and to hold as slaves. So to paraphrase that, Chief Justice Taney gave an explicitly pro-slavery interpretation of the Constitution. Says that the only two parts of the Constitution which have to deal with people of African descent, African Americans, declare that it is morally and lawfully legal, to be redundant, to deal African Americans as property and to hold them as slaves. So that's another way of saying that the only parts of the Constitution that African Americans appear in at all are very clearly sections which make them property and not persons in terms of the eyes of the law. And if you remember back to our discussions about the Constitution, we said that the first of all, the words slave and slavery or African American don't actually appear in the Constitution. So it's purposely vague, and it was made so because the Constitutional Convention, which has been a few weeks since we've talked about that, could not resolve structural differences between Northerners and Southerners. So there was discussion at the time, and there continues to be, about the actual strictly constitutional aspects of this ruling. Many legal historians, and I would include myself in agreeing with these legal historians, say that Chief Justice Taney clearly made an unconstitutional decision in saying that people of African descent were only recognized as property under the Constitution. But Chief Justice, there we go, Taney did so on purpose. Right? He wanted to give the imprimatur, the approval of the Supreme Court to the idea that the Constitution is clearly and unchangeably pro-slavery. So this decision really helped to ignite anti-slavery political organizing in the free states of the North. Because from the perspective of many anti-slavery Northerners, what they saw was the growth of what they called the slave power, which referred to a somewhat conspiratorial but also correct belief that the national government had been hijacked by slaveholding interests. What made them think that? Well, there's a Congress in which a minority of slaveholding Democrats alongside a smaller number of Northern Democrats who viewed African Americans as inferior human beings and agreed with Chief Justice Taney that they should not have citizenship rights, that a highly organized and motivated slave power had hijacked Congress, that it had hijacked the Supreme Court, hence the Dred Scott decision, right, made by a slaveholder, approved by other slaveholding justices, with only 2 dissents, both by anti-slavery Northern judges, and that the slave power, meaning these slaveholding interests, had unfairly gained control of the executive branch, right? Remembering that a majority of presidents before the Civil War were slaveholders themselves. That this slave power, which represents 10% of the white American population, and only 10% of the white population were slaveholders, had used its power unfairly and illegitimately to control the country. This belief was increasingly widespread by the end of the 1850s. And it led to the creation of a new political party, which called itself the Republican Party. And this party, first of all, as I believe I've mentioned in class, is the foundation of the Republican Party that still exists today. Was founded first at the very local level in 1852, but which by the middle and end of the 1850s had become a widespread, a popular party in the free states of the North. This party was founded as a specifically anti-slavery political party, which seems kind of odd, right? As we mentioned in class, given the general stances of Republicans today. Unlike today, where much of its support comes from the South and comes from sort of rural areas outside of the Northeast. When it was founded as a northeastern anti-slavery political party. And I believe I've mentioned this in class before, but this Republican Party for a century, until the 1960s, was always associated with the North, always associated with an anti-slavery stance, which is, again, very different from today. But what I want to do now is just read to you a section of this Republican Party's platform, official stance of positions from the 1856 presidential election, the first presidential election in which they submitted a candidate. And platforms are important as political and also legal documents because, again, they are statements of intent should, in this case, the Republican Party, succeed in electing the presidential candidate, or should they become successful in controlling Congress. So this is our political and legal statement of intent. And so I'm just going to read one section to you from a much longer platform that I think clearly demonstrates an anti-slavery legal position, an anti-slavery political stance. And it is, to quote, that we hold it to be a self-evident truth that all men are endowed with the inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, so quoting the Declaration of Independence, of course. And that the primary object and ulterior design of our federal government were to secure these rights to all persons under its exclusive jurisdiction. I'll stop there and then I'll quote some more in a little bit, but to paraphrase, the core Republican belief as expressed in this platform was that all people, by which they meant people of all races, had a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that the government was created upon the freedom principle. And if you remember last class, I talked about that. Right? The core belief, the anti-slavery constitutional belief that the government, the United States government that is, through the Constitution was created first and foremost to promote the spread of freedom. So they're stating this freedom principle. And I'll continue quoting, that as our Republican fathers, and by this they meant the founding generation that created the Constitution, that as our Republican fathers, when they had abolished slavery in all of our national territory, ordained that no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So they did two things there. One is they referred to the 1787 Northwest Ordinance, which prohibited slavery in what at the time was the Northwest, which earlier I mentioned is now called the Midwest: Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin. And further, that the founding generation's intention was to create a government in which, all quoted again, quote, "No person shall be deprived of," there's my spot, yes, "of life, liberty, or property without due process of law." What do they mean by that? Slavery deprives the enslaved of their lives, their liberty, and their property without the due process of law. Therefore, it is illegitimate. So here we have, on the one hand, through the Dred Scott decision, the clear statement of the pro-slavery constitutional view. Here in the Republican platform of 1856, we have the opposite, the clear statement of the anti-slavery constitutional view. And ultimately, these two positions, as I mentioned at the beginning of last class, were irreconcilable. You can't believe both at the same time, that the United States government is created to protect and expand freedom, the anti-slavery position, or the opposite position, that the United States Constitution was created primarily to protect private property, the pro-slavery position. Ultimately, these were irreconcilable. So when we're looking for the causes of the Civil War from the constitutional legal perspective, what, again, I've used this term many times, structural conflict allowed the Civil War to emerge, this is it. And so by the end of the 1850s, we have a scenario in which there's growing anti-slavery political and legal arguments and growing pro-slavery political and legal arguments. And these would all come to a head in the year 1860. And that's where we're going to pick up just briefly next week, and then we will talk more about that after the midterm. So I just want to wrap it up here and say, again, just as I said at the outset, that I hope you're all safe, and I hope you're all practicing social distancing. If you need anything, you can email me. Both the history department, but also Queens College as a whole have told all of us professors that there are channels that can provide help to you if you need them, that the school has set up. So if you need something, or there's some sort of situation, obviously we're all going through this coronavirus situation, that you think that I might be able to help with in terms of passing along communications through the Queens College administration, just let me know. And the system is such that if one of you communicates to me that you need help somehow, then I communicate that to the chair of the history department, who can then communicate that up further into the administration. So please reach out if you need anything. And I, again, hope you're safe. Go ahead and email me if you have any questions about the new syllabus. I heard from a few of you, but I think it's pretty straightforward. And on Wednesday, this coming Wednesday, March 25th, you will hear from me an email with the first discussion thread. So again, what I'll do is post a prompt that I want you all to respond to by Thursday. So you have 2 days to do that. And as I mentioned briefly in the syllabus, I'm going to do my best to respond to your responses. I will not have the time to respond to every single response, but my goal is to respond to all of you individually over the next few weeks as we do these discussion responses. And that way, maybe it sort of feels like we have some kind of some semblance of what we had when we were in in-person classes and we had discussions. So we're going to try to replicate that. I'm going to do my best to respond to you as much as I can. But otherwise, as I said, we have our discussion for this week, which will be posted on Wednesday. Next week, we have midterm. I'll distribute that to you on Monday, and I'll talk again in another short video. But I will now sign off. And again, any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Okay. Have a good day. It's quite rainy today, I think, but have a good day, and I will see you next Monday. Okay.